ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
A warning that this conversation includes discussion of legal processes relating to sexual assault. Listener discretion advised.
Bri Lee grew up in the suburbs of Brisbane as the daughter of a policeman and an artist. Bri studied law at university. She did well and won a prestigious job as a judge's associate just after she graduated. With this judge, Bri travelled to district courts all over Queensland. These touring court sessions dropped Bri right into some squalid and terrifying corners of Australian life. Most of the cases she was dealing with were sexual offences. And then one day evidence of a particularly awful crime compelled her to finally come to terms with a crime that had been committed against her. And so Bri went to the police and found herself on the other side of the courtroom telling her story. Bri's book on this dark episode, called Eggshell Skull, became a bestseller and changed her life. And since then, Bri has continued to write incendiary books and articles taking on the beauty industry and the world of elite education. And tomorrow, her first novel, The Work, is going to be released. Hello, Bri.
Hi, Richard.
What was your own education like as a kid?
I went to the delightful local primary school where most of my school student friends lived in the area as well. So I remember in my graduating class in grade 7 from primary school, there was 15, maybe 16 of us. And my recollections of childhood are us all just riding our bikes around the neighbourhood, going from someone's pool to someone's pool and arguing about whose mum made the best spaghetti bolognese.
Right. Is this kind of one of those classic Brisbane suburbs?
Yeah.
Lots of trees,
yes,
creeks, the Brisbane River maybe nearby,
yes,
all that sort of stuff.
Which is interesting because when I was growing up, we had the whole, there were lots of houses that were single story and people who had houses with 6 old bombs of cars littered around the front yard. Whereas now it's referred to as tightly held real estate. It's one of those suburbs that, has really come up in the last, 30 years. Yeah.
What kind of a kid were you back in those days?
I don't know, pretty regular. I remember my family had a nickname for me, which was Chat a Bit a Lot.
Chat a Bit a Lot?
Yeah, just in other words, the kind way of saying wouldn't shut up. Just precocious and chatty and just confident and happy. Just your average kid. I do recall that I had scabs all over my legs and arms all the time. Very active, doing, adventuring.
What did your mum do? I mentioned she was an artist. Did she have a kind of a more conventional job as well?
Yes, she had to. For a great deal of my childhood, she essentially had 2 jobs because she needed to have 2 jobs. She ran a small art supplies company at the Brisbane Institute of Art, which was I remember it being quite a sort of community level art school. So not your sort of national art school. It certainly wasn't like a tertiary sort of degree on that level. It would be more closer to what most people would know of TAFE. And my mum was and is a fantastic visual artist, but she had to work really hard running that shop.
And did you work there as well?
Yes. So I would take a day off school probably once a month and put a milk crate upside down behind the cash register and stand up there and serve the customers. And I remember the smell of the terps and the oil paints, and I remember the huge walls covered in all of the multicolored pastels and sheets of paper, and I loved going there. I loved it so much.
In that world of amateur art, you can see, there's a lot of kitsch and there's a lot of cack-handed sort of paintings and drawings, but every once in a while you'll come across something that's incredibly striking and brilliant. Was it like that?
Absolutely, exactly. And I'm quite grateful that my introduction to art from early childhood was being surrounded by people who were there because they just really wanted to do the work itself. They really wanted to learn and practice. And the people who went to that institution would go after their actual working day was over in the night time. So they would go on the weekends. They were there just because they wanted to, because they loved art. It was not the kind of scene that I now know of the art world.
It's kind of funny if you grow up in that milieu when you actually find where art is normal, doing art is normal,
yes,
when you meet people who've just not had that in their lives, particularly other kids who grow up in a place where art is weird.
Yes. And I remember one of my little jobs when I took the day off to help Mum was that when it came time to close up in the afternoon, I would go around to where all of the lessons were happening. Tiny kid, like knock on the edge of the door and say, "Hello, Lee's Art Supplies is closing soon if anybody needs anything." And I would be walking in and out of rooms with nude life drawing models or, these extraordinary kind of emulsion techniques happening. And it was like a wonderland and yet incredibly accessible and normal. Only when working on my new book did I have reason to reflect on what an extraordinary life beginning that is.
When you were little, your parents bought a bush block near Esk. God, I love that name for a town. Esk. What was the land like? What do you remember about it?
I still can't believe they bought 40 acres of shale. It's terrible soil. But it's a beautiful spot. It overlooks the Wivenhoe Dam. But when they bought it, it had an empty shed and a pile of rubbish. And the pile of rubbish was approximately, in my childhood recollection, the height of the empty shed. It was like, yes, what do they call that? Like a work in progress?
Work in progress. And what did your parents build there?
Well, in the interim 20-something years, they turned the shed into a home and surrounded it with gardens through the might of decades of hard work and family working bees. They now live there. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful place now where they've retired.
And did you want to go out there as a kid?
No way.
No.
Are you kidding? It takes an hour and a half to get there from Brisbane, which when you're a child is like agony.
Yeah,
that
it
is interminable.
In a car.
Like in a car.
Yeah, that's hot in Queensland.
Oh, yeah.
And winding roads, so you get car sick.
Yeah. Oh, so car sick.
Yeah.
I had the empty ice cream container every weekend. So I couldn't play a Game Boy, couldn't do anything, just looking out the window. Anyway, my recollection of a grumbling kid is that we went there every single weekend. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can say that it was character building.
Oh, good for you. That's right.
Yeah, but also another extraordinary thing. I spent weekends learning how to build my own campfires and looking for wallaby bones and making tree houses out in the bush and noticing when the little creeks were running and when they weren't. And I had an exposure to the bush and to the outdoors that I now understand is incredibly and increasingly rare. And it's something I'm really grateful for.
See, I feel sorry for you because I grew up watching tons of television and that was great. You didn't get that, you poor thing. Stuck in the great outdoors.
Don't rub it in, Richard.
Yeah, it was brilliant. So your dad changed careers and became a policeman when you were quite small. What brought that about in his mind?
Well, I remember he had this funny story that when he went to the police academy as a cadet, he was certainly the oldest person in his round of recruits. And he was very proud that he wiped the floor with a lot of the other much younger recruits. And they all had to, his story as he tells it is that they all had to sort of go around and say why they had joined the police. And, everyone's saying these big kind of noble notions and these altruistic motives. And my dad very frankly said, "I need a job."
Support my family.
To support my family. He needed a job. This was around the time when Mum would go to work at the shop in the morning, come home, feed us kids, put us to bed, and then go back and work for the night classes again. Something both my parents have is the most extraordinary work ethic. And my dad really was desperate for a job, and the police are always hiring. So that's why he joined.
What kind of policing was he doing?
Well, my understanding is that everyone, when they start, goes into what we call general duties. So you're just basically on the street, on the block, on the beat, whatever you want to call it. And he did that for several years before he moved into police prosecution, which was a negotiation within the family because when he did that, he was that bit older than the average general duties officer, and he was chasing after robbers, jumping over fences, and he, was no longer a man of his 20s or 30s. And so he took a cut. We used to call it danger pay. You would, when you're on the beat and doing sort of dangerous work, you get paid a extra amount in your salary to compensate for sort of the risk that you are in. And he took a pay cut to join the prosecutions team.
What does that mean, being a police prosecutor? It sounds vaguely illegal. What does it mean?
Yeah. Well, it's like you're acting as a legal representative for the police service, and it's particularly at the magistrates court level, so the lowest level of the courts, where the vast majority of people who ever have any experience with the court will be at Mag's court. And it's for your speeding fines, for your kind of low-level offences. And if there's a more serious offence, it will be mentioned in the magistrates court and then transferred up to the more serious court that will deal with it.
Given that he's giving evidence of an offence in court, did that put him under some danger?
Yeah, I remember once he picked me up from school and we had to do this weird loop-de-loop back home because he thought a car might be following us. And I remember we sort of, it could have been because it coincided where I was an age where I could even understand things like stranger danger. But I do remember on some level a sense that the risks posed by the world were more immediate than I had previously given thought to.
One of the risks I think police or people have when they join the police force is they can enter into quite a dark world. So much of their work is just cleaning up other people's messes that they should know better than to make in the first place, or bad behaviour, or all kinds of crappy little things that should never happen in the first place. And you can develop this quite dark view of human nature because you're constantly seeing the worst of us. The fact that your dad was an older man when he went, do you think that protected him from that awful kind of pessimism about human nature?
I think there was something different about the way my father approached policing. And I do think that policing, especially in Australia, it's an institution. And I mean, you only have to look at the results of the last few inquiries and commissions that have been done into sort of policing attitudes to see that there is a toxicity there. And I think if you join an institution like that in your like 20s or even early 30s, that institution can act on you in a much more profound way than just if you're that bit older and you have your own life, you've already got a family, you've already got experiences of the world or of other industries. I think that the fact that he joined because he needed a job would have probably helped.
Rather than going with an idea who's going to save the world.
Save people or save the world or something, yeah. And he is also, he's not a man who is attracted to or hungry for power. I speak honestly, frankly, I speak quite critically of policing and police culture in Australia. And I feel completely able to do that because the things I'm criticising are not things that I recognise in my father.
Did you ever see your dad suddenly kick into police mode while he was off duty?
Yeah, I have this really clear memory of, I was school age, still quite young. We were in his big red ute and we pulled into the local bakery. And I remember looking through the car front windscreen and there was a man and a woman at the bakery and they were having terse words with each other, but you could see just from their body language that it was very quickly escalating. And they started yelling at each other. And then the man, my recollection is that it got physical. The man sort of shoved her and suddenly everything, they talk about like your hair standing on end, like the atmosphere became electric and charged in a frightening way. And I remember my father said, "Stay in the car," like a classic stay in the car. And he was in dad-ass daggy cargo shorts and like those sort of leather slip-on sandals. And he got out of the car and I watched him walk up to this couple who were becoming frightening and he just transformed. And he, with one hand, he sort of put his hand out and down in a kind of calm down, like de-escalating way. And with the other, he pulled out his badge, which even if you're not on duty, apparently you sort of often will carry with you. And I watched him speak to this couple and just completely de-escalate the situation. And I was watching it through this screen and I had never seen my dad. I'd seen my dad in uniform, but I'd never seen my dad work. And what baffled me entirely was that when my dad had finished speaking to them, I think he took down some notes in his police notepad, they left together. And I remember as a child thinking, why on earth would that, in a child's mind, like, why did that girl leave with that boy that like shoved her? And they walked off together from the bakery towards the train station. And it's so fascinating to look back now and think about what we now know as a society about asking the question, why didn't she leave, which is the wrong question, and that it takes on average 6, 7, 8 times for a woman to get free of an abusive partner. And the real question we need to be asking is, why does he offend against her? All of that stuff, which I've subsequently learned. But yeah, I just remember really clearly the de-escalation was such a thing because it takes a lot to calm people. And I think it takes a particular type of person and Yeah, I admire my dad for a lot of reasons, but his calm assuredness is a big one of them.
Did he have that quiet authority that commands?
Oh, yeah. If you say the words to me, quiet, commanding authority, a picture of my father just is like auto-populated in my mind. Oh, yeah.
So what were your plans once you left school, Bri?
Definitely university. Neither of my parents had the opportunity to go to university. And so our whole lives, they said to my brother and I, I've got one sibling, one brother, they said, it doesn't matter what you do, you just have to get that piece of paper. That was like a really big thing. And so I knew I would go to uni. I started in a journalism arts dual degree and had fantastical visions of being a like eye-patched Marie Colvin-esque photojournalist, foreign correspondent, something or other.
Right, walking to the massacre at Srebrenica,
Something
getting the truth, holding people to account, doing all that.
Yeah,
like the
something
hero
like that.
journalist,
Yeah,
right.
exactly. And I had an extremely abysmal experience at journalism school.
Why?
All of my lecturers and tutors had been out of the profession for a number of years and were telling a cohort of about 1,000 students that we were all wasting our times because the internet had taken our jobs and the glory days of journalism were dead. And like, I just remember looking around at this lecture theatre thinking to myself, if I spend 4 years of my life doing this dual degree, I will come out the end with this piece of paper and it won't mean a thing. And so I had a very kind of knee-jerk extreme response where I thought, if this degree doesn't mean anything, well, what degree would mean the most? What could I possibly do at university that will just be a kind of guarantee of usefulness or legitimacy or validity? And that's how I ended up at law school.
Years later, you would go on to write a book about the education system, the education industrial complex,
Yes.
as we might call it. Tell me how that started when you visited a friend years and years later after you graduated who was at Oxford University.
Yeah, so my brilliant friend Damien was named a Rhodes Scholar.
Right.
And that happened a number of years ago now. And when it did, I had an extremely emotional response and obviously thrilled for him and incredibly proud of him, but also a pang, a true deep inside pang of like terrifying insecurity. And something I've learned in the last, 7 years of being my own boss and following my nose for stories, either for short things or books, is that if I have a strong emotional response to something that I can't immediately find words for, there's probably a story there. If it's like a gut feeling.
And you had insecurity?
Huge. Yeah.
But what was the thought behind that insecurity?
Well, I felt like all of my schooling, especially my extremely exclusive high school, and then certainly this was affirmed in law school, told me that there were a small number of apexes of possible academic achievement. There were a small number of things that you could do to be undoubtedly brilliant, and getting a Rhodes Scholarship was one of those. It was like I had outsourced my value system, and that value system that I just sort of copied and pasted from these institutions to my own heart and mind told me that I failed to measure up.
So this is a kind of wounded vanity, in all honesty?
Yeah, something pathetic like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I had that experience myself. And the first time I went to Oxford, I'd finished my uni degree, and this was summer, and I think I even did something stupid with friends, which is punt down the Thames in Oxford, and everything was beautiful. There's the sandstone, and I asked myself, why didn't I try for this? Not that my marks could ever have got me anywhere near that, but I felt kind of a bit ashamed in a way, or like I'd failed. Not failed, but I don't know. I just felt like, I'd missed the boat here really badly. Because it seemed to me at the time like it was a gateway to this magical kingdom. Was it like that for you?
Yes, it is. It feels exactly like a gateway to a magical world because it is a bubble. It's a total bubble. It exists like in its own sort of alternate reality, state and time.
That's not a bubble's not a doorway to a magical kingdom, though, is it? Is that more the reality of it, though? Once you inquired about it,
I think yes, yeah. I think that it is is microcosm the right word? I'm not sure. It's there are great promises to that. If you go there, you will, this phrase that we use, live a life of the mind, and you can just sort of dedicate your days to learning and kind of betterment.
Yeah, they call it the dreaming spires of Oxford, don't they? Because you can sit there and in your imagination live in the ancient world, or learn a language, explore the secrets of the cosmos and all that sort of thing. That just seems like incredibly wonderful to be able to do that for years and years and years.
Yes, and what I learnt when I went there and took tours with Damien and started sort of unpicking why that institution has that awesomeness, in the traditional sense of the word awe to it. And I realized that the only way it can be so extraordinary is by excluding the vast, vast majority of the population.
That's excellence, isn't it? That's how you reward excellence, isn't it?
Well, the trouble is that in the same way that Oxford or Cambridge, Oxbridge or these types of Rhodes scholarships, they do represent the apex of academic achievement, but there are so few people who ever actually get a chance to fulfill their potential and reach those heights because of these sort of train tracks of inequality and class that begin from schooling, and indeed that begin from early childhood education and care.
I mean, we know Britain is still dogged by its class system, but is that as true in Australia as it is in the UK?
Australia has, this is the OECD definition, the fourth most segregated by class schooling system of any OECD nation. And currently in Australia, 1 in 5 kids begin primary school, so like kindy age kids, 1 in 5 of them begin school not being able to meet their developmental milestones. And those children typically get sent to public schools that are under-resourced, and there are essentially concentrated pockets of disadvantage all around Australia that correlate broadly to geography.
When I went to high school way back in the 17th century, Bri, I'm a state school educated kid, and there was a real culture of excellence in state schools. My school I went to was regarded as the best school, state and private, in the state. It was mediocre in some places, but there were places of excellence, like in its music school, for example, which was wonderful. I wonder if that still exists. What's your understanding of how things have changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years or so when it comes to the quality of state school education versus private school education?
Well, it's tricky to have this conversation, right, where we acknowledge the extraordinary inequality and the funding disparity between private schools and public schools without just sort of automatically denigrating the extraordinary education that you can get at a number of public schools.
Yeah, indeed.
So I don't want to conflate those two things.
And also give teachers a hard time as well.
Exactly,
yeah.
Absolutely. But what is undeniable is that 3 or 4 decades ago, only about 20% of kids in Australia went to private schools. The vast majority of students all around this country went to their local state school for both primary and secondary. These days, in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, at secondary school level, it's 50-50 split. 90% of school-age students who experience any kind of disadvantage, either because of where they live or their background, what language they speak at home, how much money their parents earn, 90% of kids with any kind of disadvantage identified by the government are left behind at state schools. And it's this drift, they call it. And there is a drift both in the population of students where the sort of conventional wisdom now at play in middle-class Australia, which is a huge, and middle class means a lot of different things, is that as soon as you can possibly afford to, you will get your kid out of the public system and across to the private system to sort of buy them the best chance in life. And that drift also is happening at the teacher level, where the private schools can essentially poach teachers from the public system. And this has been compounding and getting worse and worse over the last 3 or 4 decades.
You mentioned that when you were talking about this, you were doing a bit of talkback radio and people had strong opinions on this matter.
Yes.
Was it pro or con? I mean, are such statements that you make popular or unpopular, you find? And what are some of the stronger arguments you've heard against the kind of things you've been talking about? For example, people who defend private education talk about the need for choice.
Yeah. So school funding is extremely divisive. When I toured all around the country when Who Gets to Be Smart, my book came out, that was 2021, what I heard from parents, and I'm not a parent myself, so I don't presume to have a full understanding of what that choice and dilemma feels like, which is, of course, so dependent on the parents and where the postcode in which they live and who their individual child is. But what I heard from most well-meaning parents was that they felt like they were forced into an impossible decision where they had to choose between being a good citizen and being the kind of citizen they wanted to be, and then therefore sending their kid to a public school, to the local public school, and being a good parent and putting the interests of their individual child above the interests of the collective. And it's really complicated because where I live now, so I live in King's Cross, love it. My local public school, though, the last time the local public school in my sort of postcode/catchment area had a parent fundraiser, they fundraised 6 figures. That is a very different proposition to someone who lives in a regional town where there is literally, if they even have 2 high schools, 1 public school and 1 private school. And there are stark differences in resourcing for both of them, funding for both of them, and like even instances of schoolyard violence or average graduation rates. It is like every parent in Australia is forcing a different type of decision, and people get the consistent thing is that people who have chosen to spend their money, a lot of their money, on sending their child to a private school is that they get often extremely defensive about it. It was unpleasant.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So once you got out of law school, you must have done well. You're smiling, but maybe not so well. I don't know. But you got a job as a judge's associate,
yes,
straight out of being a university graduate. What's the work of a judge's associate?
So it's a fancy word for assistant. You are a legal and administrative assistant to a judge. Are you the
person with that supermarket trolley full of law books? Is that you?
Yeah, probably. Okay. Yeah. Right. You wear the robe. You do not wear a wig, but you wear a robe, depending on what level of court your judge is at. A judge will have 1 or 2 associates. The judge I worked for, who was in the district court, had 1 associate. The judge I worked for as well did almost exclusively criminal law. And
did this require you to sit in court?
Yes, absolutely. So every week we would have 1 new trial and a handful of new sentences.
And was this like the long drive to Esk as a kid, where you have to sit there with your mouth shut and just watch and witness?
Yeah, it's really important that you have a poker face, because you are a representative and therefore sort of an extension of the judge and therefore the entire judicial system. And I'm not very good at that.
No, and so how do you do that? You just do you fight for self-control when you're hearing these terrible, because you're in the district court system and you're dealing with cases that involve violence and.
Well, the vast majority of trials and sentences were for sex offences, either child sexual abuse or adult sexual assault.
Oh, and how do you keep a straight face when you're hearing things like that in court?
I don't know. During that year, I was always, every time, the youngest and most inexperienced person in the room. And I experienced, I believe, a level of shock, a level of outrage, and a level of devastation that is actually unsustainable. And I got out, or was sort of pushed out / escaped at the end of that year. But I think that if you do that work, and I have so much admiration for the people who do that kind of work, you are forced to come up with coping mechanisms. But I didn't stay long enough to develop those.
These cases you're speaking of sexual assault that was so often before the courts that you sat in, how would they usually play out?
Well, the extra cruel thing about sex offences, either against children or against adults, is that people who are charged with them very, very rarely ever plead guilty. Like the vast majority of people who are ever charged with a regular non-sexual criminal offence plead guilty. And it drops dramatically for sex offences. And being cross-examined and having an expert tell you that you are lying about this sort of devastating thing in an alien environment with all of these strange people, some of them dressed strangely, all of them judging you, it's torturous. It is torturous. And what I saw in courtrooms that I thought was the sort of worst part, I would then go on to learn, is actually only the final sort of end tip of the iceberg, and that most survivors will have to have already gotten through 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years of investigation, pre-trial matters before they even get to the final courtroom stage.
We often hear how the cross-examination process for the victim or the person who's alleging themselves to be a victim plays out. What did you see of that, Bri?
Yeah, I just saw people being flayed alive. I saw that whole year, I obviously heard and saw so much testimony about absolutely disgusting, offending conduct. But what I saw that also really I found disgusting was conduct at the bar table. And what I mean by that is the way that legal professionals would act totally legally, but in my personal opinion, extremely unethically, in the way they chose to grill and demean and shame people during cross-examination. There are rules that are supposed to prevent certain types of questions, and they would legally get around them. You know, I saw a barrister cross-examine a woman about the length of her skirt just to test her memory, and that she was on the contraceptive pill at the time, yes, but didn't have a boyfriend, no, because they're allowed to cross-examine about what medication she was on. The subtext being you were sleeping around, therefore you were asking for what happened.
Can the prosecution then object at that point and say, not relevant, Your Honour, et cetera, and did that happen?
That did not happen in that trial that I saw. It is quite rare for prosecution to object. I think
if they could, can they say the counsel is clearly trying to intimidate and confuse and distress the person who's been cross-examined?
When people watch TV shows and movies about court processes, I think they get an extremely inflated sense of how often people stand up and say, I object.
Right.
It takes quite an extreme thing happening in a courtroom for either side of the argument to actually stand up and interrupt each other. It's not very normal. But certainly I also saw sometimes when, you know, and I will always believe in people's right to a fair trial, absolutely, and the presumption of innocence, absolutely. And I saw some lawyers who would put their client's case, put the defence case to the complainant, to the witness, and say, well, I put it to you that this happened. She, because it's almost always a she, would say, no, that's not what I remember happened. And they say, okay, you can question someone and put your client's version of the story to them without raking them across the coals.
Like, what were you wearing? Are you on the pill?
Yeah. Or even just like repeated questions, you know, getting them to the point that they're crying. Like, just, it is always a choice to not do that. But what I saw was a system that is so unfair because the prosecution, and this also answers your question about objecting or not, the prosecution are there to serve the interests of the court and the system, and defence counsel, the barrister and solicitor, are there to represent the interests of their client, the defendant. Nobody is there for the survivor. Nobody is there for the complainant. The survivor, or the complainant in the matter, is only considered a witness in the trial. She does not have legal representation.
How did this change the way you saw Australian suburbia, the suburbia you'd grown up in, the country town you spent your weekends in?
It completely upended everything I thought I knew about safety. I learned that the vast majority of sex offences, for example, are perpetrated by somebody known to the person, to the survivor, in a domestic setting and without the use of a weapon. And that there are, at the time it was 1 in 5 women who are survivors. These days, when they survey in particular young women, you're looking at more like 1 in 2. You're looking at a population who have a much higher level of understanding about relationships and sexuality and consent, who can identify that there is just this, well, increasingly less silent epidemic of women being offended against and being told to shut up and take it.
You wrote in your book Eggshell Skull that it was a particularly vile case that brought forth a memory that had been with you all your life of a sexual assault you experienced as a primary school kid that had been perpetrated upon you by a boy who was a few years older than you, and you decided then you would have to report it. That decision to report it, did that come because of what you'd seen in the courts or despite it?
No, it was because, so he was a number of years older than me. He was a young man, I would describe him as. But in particular, what I realised was that the narrative I have been telling myself that what happened to me was not that big a deal and that it was just different and not that bad and this one-off thing. When I was listening in court every single week to all of these matters, the thing I found so offensive was how textbook they all were, how almost all of them involved an older male with a younger female to varying degrees and a power imbalance and a opportunistic exploitation of that power imbalance and then some kind of guilt trip or threat to stay quiet. It was like this ABC maneuver and it worked so often. And I just had this cumulative righteous anger that the fact that none of these men and indeed none of these women and girls, and occasionally, boys who are absolutely also survivors who grow into men, that none of them were special. None of them were unique. This is, there's a playbook of offending. And then I was on circuit in one of the regional towns and I heard, it was the only time that whole year that I heard a survivor who had gotten to the end of their trial and got guilty verdicts read out their victim impact statement to the courtroom out loud. And a victim impact statement is basically a document. It's quite specific. It's just the only chance that the survivor has to say in their own words how they feel and what impact the offending had against them. And this sort of sick situation is that you have to draft that statement before you know whether or not you'll get a guilty or not guilty verdict. And you only get to read it out, of course, at the time of sentencing. So you only get to have your experience heard properly if you are one of the sort of rare lucky ones who get a guilty verdict. But anyway, this particular survivor stood up and talked about the kind of lightness and the potential closure that he could now feel having dealt with it. And his was a historical matter as well. He'd, kept quiet, as we're all supposed to, for decades. And I had it was like someone cracked an egg over my head and plunged me in an ice bath. I just knew that I had to go back to Brisbane and do something about it.
What do you remember of how you reported it to the police?
I called on the phone and they lost my first phone call, so I had to call them back weeks later. I then went into the police station and sat in a small room with two men who told me that I had misspoken and so it wasn't actually a sexual assault, it was a historical child sex offence. I am very familiar with this type of subject matter. I had not misspoken.
Judge's associate.
Yes. And having a box of tissues plonked on the table with a thump when I started crying, and then having to retell the story again in painstaking detail upstairs with one of the two of them as he did what I now refer to as the hunt and peck with the keyboard. So it took hours for me sitting there as I said sentence by sentence what my formal complaint was while he typed with one finger on each hand. It was an excruciating beginning of having to tell and retell in uncomfortable environments to people who were varying degrees of well-meaning but kind of hopeless to outright disrespectful, and at every stage was made to feel like I was being annoying and that I was causing them work and it would be better for everyone if I just shut the fuck up.
Your dad was a policeman. How did you tell him you were doing this?
I told my parents at once, and there was love and belief and acceptance, which is extraordinarily rare and What I now know from having researched it is that the way people respond to us when we first ever make a disclosure has a colossal impact on how we will then choose to deal with what happened to us and also how we feel about it ourselves. And I do not believe it's a coincidence that I felt supported and backed throughout the investigation so that I was able to get the result I did, because every person I told, parents, partner, the small number of close friends I told, all of them believed me and all of them backed me. That is such a gift. That is so rare. And I never forgot it.
Well, can you tell me about the outcome of that case?
Yeah, so my investigation, which was mercifully short at 2 years, culminated in a 2-day trial, and the man who offended against me was found guilty on both counts. And those 2 years were such agony. And these types of matters, it is currently considered acceptable and normal for these types of matters to take 3, 4, 5 years. And how we expect any survivor to live with that over their heads and just go about their normal lives is unfathomable to me. And what I also learned from doing it myself was that the longer they drag it out, the more likely the survivor is to withdraw the complaint and drop away, because it is an ongoing torture. And if people ask me, oh, what's one thing you would change if you could, the delays that we currently accept are unacceptable. And they have a real clear impact on the justice system. Injustice continues because of those delays. But what I feel and know to be true is that the book I wrote and then the advocacy I did, and I don't do that much of it anymore, but I am proud to be one small part of a social shift, like some changes, some like legislative changes, yes, also, but also cultural changes and changes in the conversation, both in society around this type of offending and, frankly, in the legal system. And I know for sure that I have changed the worst thing that was ever done to me into one of the things that I am most proud of. And so when I am forced, for me, success as a survivor is the number of days I can go without even thinking about it, which these days is pretty high, pretty good. But when I am forced to think about it or reminded of it, it is with a angry, defiant sense of pride.
Like you say, the case resulted in the conviction, and then you wrote a book which became a huge bestseller, a huge bestseller. So you were heard, as you say. Was that a relief then? Is there, rather than closure, is there a sense of being unburdened, maybe?
Yeah, and there's something extraordinarily liberating about taking the thing that you are like most afraid of and most made to feel ashamed of and telling the whole world at once. I know it's, and I am so aware of how easy it is for me to talk about this because I got the guilty verdict. For the record, the number of people offended against with any kind of sex crime compared to the number who get guilty convictions in a court in Australia, you're talking about a single-digit percentage. I am very aware of that. But for me, I'm kind of invincible now. There is nothing anyone can try to put on me, or there's no way that someone can try and shame me or like I am now almost impervious to other people's opinions of me. It's just, it feels incredibly good having that, like, absolutely without a doubt in the rear vision mirror.
Yeah, they say the best instruction to a writer is to write from your greatest source of pain. And there it is. And so now, since then, you've written these other books, one on education, like Who Gets to Be Smart, beauty on the beauty industry, and now your first novel called The Work. Where's the pain here, Bri? Where's the pain? What itch are you trying to scratch by writing a novel?
Well, books take a long time. For when I write a book, it takes usually at least 3 years. This one took 5. And writing a book, for the most part, looks like sitting by yourself in a room. And for that to be like a sustainable practice for me, I'll try and speak for myself. It has to be driven by like a question or an issue.
Sorry, just as you say
Yeah.
that, that's so true. So much of writing a book is sitting still in a room, and it's very irritating to people around you. That's the other thing as well, because it doesn't look like you're working. That's why you need a room of your own, isn't it? That's right, where you can shut the door and people don't get irritated by the sight of you sitting there thinking.
Yes, if you ever see me and I'm just sitting by myself staring off into the distance, be assured that I am working very hard.
No, go to her and ask her to lift something heavy, as Clive James would say. Come on, Bri, come and lift something heavy. Be useful.
But I feel like my work, I start with a question or I start with an issue. And then as I start thinking about ways that I might answer that question or address that issue, a container presents itself. So with my 3 first books, although they are all nonfiction, they're very, very different types of nonfiction. So Eggshell Skull was the first one. That's a memoir told chronologically. It's quite sort of straightforward classic format of approximately 3 years of my life. Beauty was an essay-length book, a very personal and argumentative essay. And then Who Gets to Be Smart was this sort of full-length book, but a collection of themed essays also sort of told chronologically.
Yeah, and like an act of journalism.
Yes, it was very much. First person, come along with me as I learn about this.
So now you're purely in the realm of the imagination.
Yes.
But is there, it's sort of set loosely around the New York art world and the kind of choices people make to be part of that world. What's changed in your personal circumstances that's given you the impetus to want to explore those ideas, Bri?
Well, the question I had was born in 2018 when Eggshell Skull did really well, which is how does money affect love and how does money affect art?
How did having a best-selling book affect your personal circumstances?
Well, I don't know what to do with the fact that, and maybe there's nothing you can do with it, that I wrote a memoir about extreme trauma and it was devastating, and then it sold so well that I now have the career of my dreams and artistic freedom. Like, what is this, like, bloodletting that then leads to independence and fulfillment? This extreme way in which our current media ecosystem and very online, very hungry for content, hungry for stories, society is this like meat grinder for personal trauma and personal stories and stories about people's identities. And
You didn't feel guilt about your book doing well, though, did you?
not guilty, but it's some kind of conflict.
It's an odd dynamic, isn't
It's
it?
a fucking odd dynamic. Like, I don't know what do you do with that? And at the same time, I was also seeing, this is like mid to late 20s, living in awful share houses in Brisbane and then moving into like an awful apartment with my partner, where there's like, there's a crack, there are cracks between every piece of wood and you can see to the dirt underneath the house and the roaches are crawling up through it.
Right. But it did lift you out of group house living.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And at that time, I was watching I had been writing for a few years instead of lawyering, and I was watching the creatives around me and seeing the huge difference it made to their ability to create and have meaningful artistic freedom through financial independence that was so much tied to the market. And I was also seeing the couples that could and could not afford to live together. And it seemed to me like the thing that I was grappling with for all of those years of my late 20s was trying to be honest with myself and honest with the world around me about when money did and didn't make a big difference to the sort of things that we would like to think are untouched by money.
And yet you weren't writing for a market. I've seen this again and again. People who struggle all their lives to create something with a market in mind, fail and never have it work, write something that's utterly authentic that they figure will maybe be consumed by 2 or 3 people. And that's the thing that lifts them out of obscurity and poverty.
That has been exactly like verbatim my experience. When I started writing Eggshell Skull, it was pre-Harvey Weinstein, Me Too hitting the mainstream. I thought that book would reach a very small number, probably of mostly lawyers. Ideally, it might mean a lot to a few people. And nobody was more surprised than I was by how big it went when it came out. And then also, even with this novel, I took my time with it and did not at all respond to the things that I know have been selling.
You've written that you've now changed your view on ornamental pots. What do you mean, Bri? What are ornamental pots? Not literally ornamental pots.
So Virginia Woolf.
I like ornamental pots
yes,
myself.
I actually do. Yes.
So it's not ornamental pots we're talking about.
I have a home full of vases and ornamental pots, it's true. But in Virginia Woolf's fantastic essay, A Room of One's Own, she talks about these, she uses this phrase, which I've now taken and run with, ornamental pots, to refer to these, to bring it back, pieces of paper, essentially, these sort of seals of approval from institutions. So not just your degrees, but then like the fellowships and the honorary verblagans and the distinguished blurblers and this like...
I'll have you know I'm a distinguished blah, blah. I've had that framed on my wall. I'm deeply offended, Bri.
But, you know, like these accolades that people get and she calls them ornamental pots because you get it, you receive it, you take it home and you put it on your mantle. And it's like an ornamental pot that communicates, I guess, to you and the people around you that you are worthy.
You're valid.
Valid.
You can stay. You can stay in that room.
Yes.
The room with all the other people with the distinguished blah, blah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think you're a distinguished blah, blah. Nonetheless, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you, Bri, and fascinating as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
It started with a Saturday lunch. It ended with 3 people dead. The suspected cause, allegedly poisonous mushrooms. The cook, Erin Patterson, has been charged with murder and attempted murder. She says she's innocent.
I'm devastated. I love them.
I'm Christian Silver, host of the new ABC podcast Mushroom Case Daily. It's a podcast that follows the case of Erin Patterson as it happens. And if and when it heads to a full trial, we'll be there daily. To be the first to hear updates, follow Mushroom Case Daily on the ABC Listen app.